So my name is Nina Folles, for those who don't know me, and Lamia is joining us, and I'm the managing director of Paeradigms, and we are a group of people. There's a couple of colleagues here as well, and many of us have really been very much involved in lifelong learning and knowledge exchange sharing. Lamia, hello. It's nice to see you here after such a long webinar just before. Really appreciate
just taking a breath and then to get ready to the second webinar.
Yeah. So I was saying, so we had already launched the series sometime last year, and the idea is really to have a very small group of people that allows really for exchange and discussion, and not a big group of people. That is so it's actually perfect here, because it's really important. That allows us to have a conversation afterwards. And we really, we were very much encouraged by our colleague Amin here from Lebanon, who's sitting there, who's doing his PhD right now on actually ethical leadership. And one of the things he told me in a conversation recently, he said, knowledge sharing is part of ethical leadership. So to share it's not just grabbing the knowledge from others, but sharing it with others. And that's part of ethical leadership. And I thought, okay, now we have to definitely come back to doing this dialogue series. There's a great group of people that we know and others that we don't know, but why not create a very, something rather small and, exchange knowledge. Everybody has got so much knowledge. And yeah, so here we are. So I'm absolutely delighted. I mean, first of all, I would really love for everybody to change their name or put behind their name the country where they are from, and by right-clicking with your mouse on your name, you can change the name. Actually, you can. The button it says rename, and it would be really nice to see where, because I know Lamia is in Egypt, Ruth is in Kenya. Gilbert is in Kenya. I know more or less where people are, but Jana, you're in Colombia. Oh, wow. Okay, good. I was thinking you were sitting also in Berlin for some reason. I don't know, but okay.
My last name and the country are redundant, but I'll do it anyway. You'll see.
Yeah. So, so today, Isabel is sharing her knowledge. So Isabel is from Colombia, and she's an education policy expert. She's based in Berlin, as we just discussed, and holds a master's degree in public policy from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And Isabel is particularly interested in education as a vehicle for social justice and social mobility. And she started out as a secondary school teacher, which gives her valuable first-hand experience, and then worked over the next years on strengthening the rule of law and the promotion of social justice, always is linked to education. So is more time in school worth it, is the question. So in quite a few countries now, to improve the coverage of the school system that is very stressed in primary and secondary education, schools have introduced partial school days, basically shifts, where there's the first shift and the second shift, same infrastructure, same teachers. But what effects does that have on learning outcomes, and what are the implications of this policy on social equity? So Isabel, please add to it. You're the expert here, and we will have a presentation, and then we'll try to have enough room for discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Nina, for the presentation and the invitation. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I just want to check, can everybody hear and see me okay? Just so that I can, awesome, great. Okay, somebody else joined. Okay, so I don't want to add anything else to my profile other than what Nina said. Just one quick thing. The reason for me to choose the master's at Hertie was that I realized that behind the theoretical questions that I was interested in lay empirical questions that I didn't have the resources to address because I had basically never studied statistics. And if you have never done it, it's a hard world out there, and if you want to participate in policy discussions. So what you'll see today is kind of the result of my first attempts to familiarize with statistical methods and kind of find a way to bring to the theoretical discussions that I'm interested in substantial empirical knowledge. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna share my screen and we can take it away. Okay, so you should be seeing my PowerPoint right now. I hope that's the case. Good. So the title of this paper is More Time in School Worth It? And I'm going to concentrate on the effects of two-shift schooling on performance from a longitudinal study in Colombia. But before I dive into this very, very concrete, very specific question, I wanted to offer a bit of the big picture. I wanted to tell you where this research is framed for me personally, where my interests lie in education policy. And as Nina mentioned briefly, what keeps me up at night is the relationship between education and inequality. And here I find that schools are these very, very particular, very peculiar institutions because depending on who you ask, they're either the key to social mobility, and there you have like meritocracy enthusiasts and people who think that building schools is really the way out of poverty. But if you're more on the cultural reproduction theory side of the debate, what you probably tend to think of schools is that their institutions were disparities in family background are exacerbated and really where class roles are created. So those are two very, very different views. And then on top of that, in context of weak state capacity, schools are very often the victim of what Ferguson, an economist, a Colombian economist, calls the public goods trap. This is what happens where public goods, in this case education, are not well provided by the state, and therefore the wealthy who can afford it provide solutions for those or access these services privately, therefore removing the pressure on the state to better these services, and therefore the state doesn't improve, these services don't improve, they oftentimes even worsen. This is true for schools in all dimensions, but also for concrete education policies. And I'm really interested in figuring out how to deal with these two things. And so because we don't want to do away with schools, an option will be, if they're so complicated, just shut them. But we don't want to do them, so we don't want to do that. So my question is, how do we tilt them in our favor? And that means, how do we build schools that are really tools to build social justice? This is sort of the big picture, the big frame of my research. So, sorry, I think I'm getting some feedback. Is everybody hearing me okay? Okay, cool. Okay, so with this in mind, I decided to focus on partial day schooling. So a bit of context for this, I'm going to ask you to think back to Colombia in the 1950s and 1960s. Education levels were really, really low. Just for you to get an idea, for people in the cities in 1950, the average education level was 4 years, and it was 2 for people in rural areas. And we had huge problems in coverage, in access, in teacher education. There were really a lot of things to address. But because we had limited resources, shift schooling policies were introduced. This is not new to Colombia. It happened everywhere. As far as I know, those policies tend to be introduced around the 1950s and 60s, and they're always intended to be temporary. So what is shift school? What does that mean? It means that the same classrooms, therefore the same physical infrastructure and the same teachers, the same human resources, are used to accommodate 2 or more shifts of students per day. So this typically means a morning and afternoon shift, but it can go as far as having a morning and afternoon, a night and a Sunday, and a weekend school shift. And it was introduced in Colombia in 1965 in the 5 biggest cities, and then widened the next year to the national level. And then since this policy was introduced, we have really made enormous gains in the education sector in Colombia. So by the year 2000s, just to see how things have improved, in the cities, the average person would have 8 years of schooling, and it was 4 for rural areas. And in 2017, city dwellers had almost 10 years of education, and people in rural areas 6 years. This still puts Colombia behind many other countries in the region, but the positive trend is, I think, very, very clear. There are a variety of causes for this, of course, but shift schooling is said to have at least helped achieve these results. But by 1994, because it was always intended to be a temporary measure, the government decides to hire La Misión de Expertos, so the experts mission, to help them design public education policy for the next 20 years. And they uniformly recommend dismounting, rolling back partial day schooling. But I guess because nothing is more permanent than a temporary measure, efforts to roll this policy back have been very, very slow, to say the least. So by 2019, not even 30% of children in Colombia had access to full day schooling. And even worse than that, there are huge regional disparities. So while in Bogotá, 46% of children have access to full day schools, it is only 4% in areas such as Arauca. And in Vaupés, for example, of the 10,000 children of school age, none have access to full day schooling. This is then clearly a policy that impacts a lot of children, and I think that is one of the reasons that it merits attention. But the debate around it has been, in my opinion, very, very politicized and is very, very poorly informed. I'm going to walk you through now the main arguments around it. So those in favor of shift schooling say that it is more efficient because it allows for the same infrastructure to be used to cover more pupils. They say it reduces overcrowding in classrooms because you can separate kids into a morning and an afternoon shift. They claim that it allows for teachers to have better salaries without it costing too much, because teachers who work for the 2 shifts are not paid double, but they're paid a bit more. So it's kind of like this easy sell for teachers, apparently. They say that it reduces the opportunity cost of schooling because children who attend school for only half a day can afford to work for the rest of the day. They say that it allows for targeted attention to underprivileged communities who usually attend these partial day schools. And they claim that it has no negative effects on learning, or that it should not have negative effects on learning, because what is important for learning is time on task. So how much a kid spends doing what he's supposed to be doing instead of how much he's actually in school. On the other hand, those against partial day schooling claim that there are no real fiscal gains because not all schools actually do the 2 shifts. Some of them have just reduced and used half of their capacity, so to speak. So they only do the morning shift, or they only do the afternoon shift. That is the case in Colombia for a large number of schools. They also point out that it widens gaps in the school system because it differentiates between children who have access to full-day schooling and those who don't. It increases differences in teacher quality and contributes to the precarization of the profession. Teachers tend not to teach in both shifts because it is too much work, as anybody who's worked as a teacher could have told them. And so what you end up having is that teachers who are better prepared end up preferring one of the two shifts, and this again creates disparities. They point out that this policies incentivize child labor, which is horrible, but also that it widens social inequity because, of course, a child who has to attend school in the morning and then work in the afternoon will not perform as well as a kid who gets time off or time to do their homework or the rest. They say that there is self-selection into this more, instead of like targeting, that there is self-selection into the schools, and therefore you create a more segregated schooling system. And they also think that it should have big negative effects on learning, precisely because what matters is time on task, and many children only have time, their only time on task is time spent at school. So children who outside of school have no opportunity to study or learn or read will suffer under this policy. But as you see, this is a very controversial, very heated debate, but there's so much data here. And this is sort of what I found when I started digging into it. So the question I had was really the same question as Calvin. I just wanted to know if going to school was a big fat waste of the kids' time. But my supervisor objected to that phrasing. So I decided to ask, what are the effects of two-shift schooling on standardized test performance? And then I wanted to know if they are the same, if these effects are the same for all children. And because I thought that this was very unlikely, I wanted to know what the differences that I expected to find would tell us about the role schools play as vehicles for social equity. And so this is kind of the setup of my research. So what did I use? I used panel data from Pruebas Saber in Colombia. Pruebas Saber are standardized tests. They're conducted every year for children in the 3rd, 5th, 9th, and 11th grade. They test a variety of subjects, and the subjects tested change year depending on which year you're testing. But mathematics and language are tested on every level. So those are the two that I concentrated in. I had a little over 32,000 students, which accounted, because I had panel data, like good, perfect panel data, for a little over 65,000 observations, which is statistically very exciting. And then I had data from the Synthetics Index of Education Quality. This is a measure, I think it's a really cool index. I think it's really well constructed. And what it does is it takes 4 components and gives each school a measure of quality. So it measures performance, so average testing scores from the students. It measures progress, just to see, which is a comparison between the students who do the worst and those who do best in a school, just to see that you don't have skewed results by a couple of really, really smart kids in a school. It takes into account efficiency, so how many kids get promoted to the next level. And then it has a measure of school environment. I think it's a really, really good measure of school quality. And so I used that. And then I did a fixed effects model, which, given that I had panel data, was the most likely to include less bias, and it allowed within individual comparisons, which are inherently better than what I would have gotten with an OLS regression. These results are driven by what I call changers. So these are kids who, during the years that I observed them, changed from partial day schooling into full day schooling. In my sample, these are a little over 4,000 students, so around like 15% of their sample, which is still statistically robust. And I did, besides the fixed effects model for the whole sample, a couple of fixed effects models on subsamples or subgroups of the sample intended as robustness tests, just to see if I could test for effect heterogeneity on time constant traits. I'll say a bit more on that when I speak about my results. Okay, so my variables are here. Don't get scared. I know it's a lot, but so for the dependent variables, I use the performance in mathematics and in language. One quick thing there, most studies tend to pool results just because it's easier. It allows you to report just one coefficient, but I reported always the separate values, and because differences there are interesting. I'll say more on that in a minute. And then for the independent variables, what I had were individual level variables. So gender, student socioeconomic status, and the education of the parents, and school level variables. Of course, whether it was a full day or not, if the school was private or public, if it was in a rural or urban area, what the socioeconomic level of the school in general was, like not for the particular student, but in general, and then the school quality level. Oh, I forgot to say the quality index gives each school a measure, which is a number, but because they are not intended to be interpreted substantially, so each number doesn't mean anything. There's not like a passing grade for schools. What I did was lump them up into 3 brackets, and I'll just report low, medium, and high quality schools. Okay, so that's my setup. And because this wouldn't be academics if I didn't have caveats, I'll tell you 2 contributions and 2 caveats that I think make my research particular. So the first thing is that because individual level data was not available before 2017 for Prueba Saber, there was no possibility of doing panel data before that. I'm sure more researchers are working on that, but one of the things that makes this paper new and I think exciting is that it's one of the first opportunities to really take advantage of that data. And the second thing is that, as far as I've seen, and this is a bit more surprising because that data was available before, I haven't seen any research that includes the school quality measure that I've included. Instead, what you typically see is that they interpret average performance of students as a measure of school quality. And I think that's really problematic because good schools are not, or better schools, are not necessarily schools where kids perform better, but maybe better schools are schools that are doing the most for students who are struggling. So if you have students who test very poorly, but you're helping them along nicely, you're more like, it makes more sense to think of that as a good school. And I haven't done that. I haven't seen that in previous research. And then 2 caveats. The first thing is that I was a teacher. I am fully aware that test scores are imperfect measures of learning. And I don't want to shy away of the discussions around meritocracy and how unfair the distribution of opportunities depending on test scores is. I think that is incredibly important. That is what I would like to work on in the future. However, test scores effectively condition access to further learning and to learning opportunities, to scholarships. So I think they're worth studying at least. And then the last thing is, how do you interpret effect size? This is always hard, but in education it is especially hard because education measures tend to be arbitrary. You're not speaking about income where you intuitively have a sense of how much better this income is than this one or so. So what normally is used are benchmarks. I'm going to use the ones that Matthew Kraft proposes in a paper that he published in 2019. I think it's a really, really cool paper. I'm happy to share it with whoever is interested. And what he proposes are these 3 levels of measuring an effect size. I know that 0.2 standard deviations seems small. So for anybody who is somewhat skeptical, what CRAFT offers is this. By the 5th grade, student achievement improves about 0.4 standard deviations or less over the course of a whole academic year. So formal schooling, or society's defining education interventional, barely qualifies as producing large effects in middle and high school. And additionally, raising a student achievement by 0.2 standard deviations results in the long run in a 2% increase in annual lifetime earnings on average. So again, these effects seem small, but they have very, very big consequences. In any case, I am much more interested in trends than in coefficients. I'll report coefficients there in my paper if you want to check them out, but my intuition is more about the trends, and that is what I would like to concentrate on. Okay, so that being said, let's go to the fixed effects model and what I actually got. So the first thing that I would like to show you is the result for the test scores pooled, so the mathematics and the language together. They're relatively big, they're significant. You get the 3 little stars that tell you that you're statistically sound, which is always very exciting. But if you look at them more closely, you start seeing that they're distributed very unevenly across subjects. So the mathematic chunks of the effect is a lot bigger than the language part. Just to draw back on the CRAFT benchmarks, 1 standard deviation of performance in mathematics is 0.79 points and in language 0.72. So this means that this one is a large effect and the language course is a medium effect. They're both significant. Every coefficient in all the models that I tested is either large or medium by CRAFT's benchmarks, but what I'm more interested in is the disparity between these two subjects that I think is really interesting. Okay, and so I run, as I had told you, also robustness tests. What I did here was choose subsamples that allow me to partition my sample, like the big data, on little parts that were the same according to time constant traits. So I tested urban versus rural schools, public versus private schools, schools then according to their socioeconomic status, children according to their socioeconomic status, and school quality. I'm not going to report individual coefficients for each of these models because they're a lot. They're all available in the paper, and I'm happy to discuss them individually if you have questions. But the trends are as follows. So the first thing is that the discrepancy in the effect size between subjects appears in all subsamples. No matter, and it's always in the same direction. So effects in mathematics are always bigger than they are in language. Oh, and I should probably say effects appear in all subsamples. Yeah, they're relatively, they follow the same trend as in the fixed effects model for the whole data set. Then the second thing is that effects are larger for rural schools than they are for urban ones. For schools that have poorer, less resources, lower socioeconomic status, and also for students, the results tend to be bigger the lower their socioeconomic status is. And then the final thing is that school quality that I would have anticipated just traced very linearly with how these results appeared behaves very differently. So longer school days, according to my data, make the most difference at both ends of the quality spectrum, and they dip for middle quality schools, for medium quality schools. Not only that, but the effect is also largest for poor quality schools, which which was very, very surprising. Okay, so what do these results mean? Or if we go back to Calvin, what would Hobbes answer to this initial question? So luckily for me, who am a school enthusiasm and would sometime hope to work again as a teacher, no, school time is not a waste after all. Over all models, and this is somewhat predictable, I guess, more instruction time led to better test scores in the pooled and the per subject outcomes for mathematics and language. This is anticlimactic, I understand that, but I think it's reassuring. I guess it's always good to have the data to back it up. Then as a second result, full-length school days make the most difference in rural schools, poor schools, and for underprivileged children. And I take this to mean that schools make more of a difference wherever other resources are more limited. And I think this is key. If you think back at the big picture that I was trying to get at, I think this really tells us how this really, really small concrete policy issue relates to that context. Okay, and then a couple of less predictable things. The first is that results indicate that lengthening the school day, so having access to a full day of school, has a larger impact on mathematics than on languages. And as I said, this result is consistent across all models. I'm not sure why that is, and my data doesn't at this time allow me to answer this question more precisely. There's a couple of theories in the literature that could elucidate it. So one theory has it been due to the fact that mathematics are learned in school while language is picked up at home rather. I think this is true for younger kids, but in the 9th and 11th grade, I'm not super sure that I'm convinced by that argument. I would think rather than there might be an issue with how we're testing. If you think about it, standardized testing tends to, in the language test, tends to concentrate on reading skills, but in higher levels of education, what we are teaching are more writing skills. So there might be a disparity between what we're teaching and what we're testing at that level, and we don't see the effects of having longer school days because of that. But we really don't know, and my data doesn't allow me to answer that any further for the moment. And then the relationship between a school's quality and its ability to transform instruction time into good grades is not linear. And I think that is very, very surprising. This means that or at least my initial intuition, that good schools would put additional time to good use might be true, but that the less intuitive explanation that in very bad schools, because they are very bad and very inefficient, every additional hour counts, seems to be supported by the data. That is, I think, very very weird. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on that if you have any. But in any case, what I think this means is that full day schooling is most important for children who are all around less favored, and this is even true for those for which it means that they attend poor quality schools. So again, here I think there's a very relevant question of social equity, basically, in how we tackle this policy. Okay, so some final thoughts. The first is that rolling back shift schooling is crucial. I understand that these results might be underwhelming for some, in the sense that they tell us that schools that they're important, and we kind of know that. But I think having this data and thinking about the policy context in Colombia, I think it's really crucial that we know that they make a difference. And moreover, rolling back this policy is cheap because we're not saving as much through it as we would like to. The second thing is that even though schools are complex, and I don't want to disregard the questioning that people might have about their role in strengthening class roles or even producing them, they're valuable social institutions. And they are an essential part of the development of kids who otherwise don't get as many chances. So they should be socially surrounded, supported, and really built up, I think. And so finally, yes, I think some educational arrangements contribute to the perpetuation of inequalities. But the key thing, or the thing that gives me at least hope, is that they don't have to. And so that means that concrete policy decisions, policy choices can actually tilt them our way, which is kind of what I hope to do someday. Okay, so thank you for listening, and to Paeradigms for hosting and inviting me. And now I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay. I must also say, Amina has a question already. Great. I'll give you the mic in a second. I just wanted to say that I'm super happy to discuss the research that I did, but I would also be interested in hearing what you are working on. And as you heard from Nina, I recently graduated from Hertie. So if there are opportunities for me to collaborate with any of you, I would be super interested in that. Amina, please.
Thank you, Isabel, for this exciting presentation and research topic. Well, the numbers meant a lot to me because I'm doing quantitative research as well. I'm researching the impact of ethical leadership and knowledge exchange and looking at the different commitments of employees. Anyway, I have two questions for you. First, did you check the normality of the data? I'm asking this because when it comes to social sciences data, it's always not normal, and there are always a lot of things that you have to do to be able to work with the data. So just checking whether you've checked for the normality of the data, because I'm going through a lot of challenges there, right, myself. And the other question is when you mentioned or when you questioned whether the tests are actually testing what we want to look at, because somewhere towards the end of the presentation you were questioning the validity of the tests when you said that we teach them how to read, and then at later stage we test their writing. But then again, when it comes to the actual testing, there's a big question mark there, right? I'm not sure if I got that right. So if you could just clarify that point, and whether the point that you were actually raising is that we need to validate those tests. So maybe we have taken for granted for a long time these tests, and we have counted on them and depended on the results that they've given. But maybe it's time to give them a second look or a second examination, right? Is this what you're hinting at, or is this what you're saying actually?
Okay, so I'll answer the more research-focused question first. Yes, I did check for normality, and as far as I know, I'm not a statistician yet.
Yeah, it's okay.
But yeah, as far as I know, the data was sufficiently, I don't even know how to say it, distributed sufficiently in a normal way.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's phrased correctly, to be for my results to be sound. There was one, so the socioeconomic level at the school level had really few observations on the last bracket. So for the richest schools, so what I ended up doing was dropping that level. That is controversial, I think. Could be.
Yeah, I'm actually going through that thing as well, because I have the option of dropping some data, but then again, I would not be reflecting the actual population, right? Because I'm choosing to drop some observations.
No, but I didn't, hold on, I didn't drop observation.
Okay.
So what I got at the end was a data set where I had no observations for that last bracket. And the theoretical thinking behind that being okay is that schools in Colombia that have that socioeconomic level are so few that actually
They're not representative.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that was the only other thing. Yeah, but I'm happy to chat more about that if you have further questions. But on the testing thing, I mentioned testing 2 times, one at the very beginning, because I understand that testing is a very limited, at least, measure of what children actually know and what children actually go to do in school. Schools, regardless of whether you learn anything in school, schools protect you against violence, recruitment by armed groups, teenage pregnancy, domestic violence. Like, there's a million reasons to have kids in school. And whether or not they do well in testing is it's a tiny fraction of that. And beyond that, how much of what kids actually learn reflects in how well they test is also super contended. So there are a lot of reasons not to use tests. But my thinking is tests, they exist and they can be used for research. Other measures of knowledge are a lot harder. And then even if they're imperfect, they are concrete gateways to further education opportunities. They are the key for scholarships, for promotion to the next education level. So I thought it was wise to use them just instrumentally for that. And then at the end of the presentation, what I mentioned is that I am not sure, I am very puzzled by the discrepancy in the size of the effects in the mathematics and the language test scores. I think that it shows up in very little research because, as I said, results tend to be pooled for all subjects. And I think it's just really weird that if kids are going to school to attend classes in all subjects, that just shows up in one of the subjects. It's really, I don't know, it's puzzling to me. But one of the things that I think might be behind that is that I think testing, especially if you're thinking about standardized testing, is better aligned with what you're teaching kids in mathematics than it is in language. And that is what I meant at the end. So because at the highest levels of education, what you're actually teaching are writing skills. Typically, I mean, you're teaching a lot of things, but typically that. And standardized testing tends not to test for that because you don't, and Prueba Saber definitely doesn't, then there might be a disparity there between what we're teaching and what we're testing that might explain why having kids in school for longer doesn't contribute to them improving their scores. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Sure. I'm not sure. Okay, yeah.
Lamia?
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you so much, Isabel, for this very important topic of research. I believe it is very interesting, and it tackles a very important concept, which is social equity. But I'm afraid when we're talking, this is my own point of view, I'm really interested in the qualitative type of research more than quantitative research. It's all about numbers and data and yes, but when we are talking about human beings, when we are tackling human issues, it's preferable to analyze and interpret the numbers, the figures, the tables that you have reached, what does it mean in reality? And since we were talking about social equity, maybe this is a suggestion for further research in the future. Where can we find the SEN students, special educational needs students, if we're talking about social equity? Because from what I've heard so far, that you are talking about the students with maybe special backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, economics, social. But again, if we are talking about social equity, it triggers my mind right away what we are talking about, the where the special needs students, the disabilities learners, the students that they are struggling with the learning and on so many levels. So I would suggest that if we are going to look at the topic from this angle, maybe ethnographies would be more better. If we are dealing with these kind of topics, you need to go and live at the schools and see and observe and taking notes. Besides or plus the standardized, the test and the grades and the marks, and what do they refer to, what do they reflect. If we are talking, and this is very important, if we are talking about this kind of humanities research, it is very important to not just rely on the numbers. As I've said before, you need to interpret and you need to highlight the meanings of these numbers. It's not just about see the difference between male and females and the various types or various social economic qualities of the schools. You need to talk to persons. You need to see and hear their feelings, their perceptions, their attitudes about long hours of schooling, long hours of workloads teachers are responsible for. I'm talking from an experience, because I have I had the experience of supervising and monitoring students of third and fourth grades of Faculty of Education. We tell them to go to schools for a semester and live the experience of being a teacher, responsible for planning, responsible for monitoring the students, responsible for solving problems, cooperating with the administrative staff members of the schools. So most likely we go in Egypt, if we are going to talk about the practicum or the practical teaching at the governmental schools, and pretty much the situation that you have described of the shifts, morning shifts and afternoon shifts, that they are struggling with because of the lack of resources, because of the low numbers of competent and qualified teachers. So maybe we find the same teacher, especially in the primary stage, is teaching more than one subject and is responsible for more than one subject. And at the end of the day, what is the quality of the education that you are providing the students with? So from my experience, I believe that living the situation and not just relying on the results of the grades of the students, and maybe doing, as I've said, ethnographies or maybe interviews, go involving parents as well. It's very important if we are talking about social equity. Other stakeholders may be added to the equation other than teachers and students. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amia. Yeah, this is a, I think I vastly agree. I mean, I do like the new quantitative skills that I've learned. However, and this was, I mean, I was the first to be surprised by this. I'm honest, if I'm honest about it, but I don't think people who use quantitative methods are as blind to the human side of what they're discussing as at least I tended to believe. I don't think numbers by themselves tell you anything. And so, although I understand that the research could be complemented with qualitative research, I think qualitative interpretations of quantitative research are actually a pretty cool mix. So yeah, that on the methodological side. Your point about children who might be struggling with learning difficulties, for example, that is a whole other ballgame. That is so education is hard, but special education is is a lot more difficult. I understand that is very obvious, but I say it just as a way. I don't think I know remotely as much as I should about special education. And then the thing about your comment about other stakeholders, I think that is, of course, incredibly important if one wants to actually achieve policy change. One thing, though, that I think is actually helpful, having dealt with parents myself, for example, is having some sort of research behind it. And the motivation behind this paper was also that I tend to think that the debate around two-shift schooling is super politicized. And I am not advocating for neutral discussions at all. I have a very, very clear position regarding this topic. But I think this, like having more quantitative, even research behind your results, can actually help you gain more allies. And I think it's useful in that sense. Nikki, go for it. Oh, and Anna was also there. Oh, sorry, Nikki, and I think Anna had her hand up before. Anne, please go for it.
There we go. Thank you. Fascinating research. I am also more of a qualitative researcher than a quantitative researcher, but I actually quite admire the fortitude to to get through the numbers. So I appreciate that. And I think your research is fascinating. I focused in on one thing you were talking about, which was you were surprised by the how the poor quality schools actually benefited significantly from the additional hours. I am a head of school of an international school, and my research was on a secondary program. And so when I think about it, one of the things I think about is what else would they be doing? So in other words, in those hours that they aren't at school, those in the poorer quality schools could possibly be doing things that are not academically related, whereas families that have more means, they tend to have more after school activities. They're more likely to have books and things at home where kids would be more likely to be continuing their education. And there may also be just a different expectation outside of school hours with what they're doing with their time. So I think that would be, since you do find that that's interesting, it would be interesting to follow up the research with what are they doing? What are the various students doing in their off hours? And that might also point to some of your, the reasons why you're seeing the data that you're seeing. So that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. One thing, though, to what my data does tell me about what they might be doing. So I don't have data on what they're doing outside of school, but because I do have data on their socioeconomic status, the part of that influence that would be explained by their wealth is sort of taken care of. I don't think that that is the whole of it. Of course, there are children, for example, in poorer communities that have very good community after school programs, for example, and that might be a part of it. And that part, so to speak, I'm blind to. However, I do think a very substantial part of what a kid does after hours is dependent on their socioeconomic status, and that I do have data for, and it doesn't explain it. So yeah, it's really weird. So I think there I would need really to do more digging, and I'm not super sure in which direction. Maybe exploring what kids do after hours more substantially would be part of the answer. Okay. Nikki, do you want to go?
Yes, no, congratulations, Isa, on the research, and reading it and learning from you from the presentation is also always very informative. One of the conclusions that you reached that really caught my attention and I think it's the same as Anne was mentioning, more resources to schools that have been less benefited by social programs, etc., seem to have a larger impact. And I was thinking, when you find that type of conclusion for other programs that are not social, that leads you to certain conclusions, such as, well, let's pull resources from one side and invest them in this other side. And of course, because we're talking about humans, that would be a dangerous maybe conclusion to go to. But what type of policy do you imagine maybe local authorities or more at the national level the Ministry of Education could do? And also what type of, I guess what's relevant, very important about this type of data is that then institutions that might want to invest in particular types of schools have also justification on why it's a good decision to invest there or not. But yeah, so from the policy side, what do you think could be a policy step?
Okay. Super hard question as always with you, but super interesting one. So I think for me, the issue really is solving this public goods trap. I don't know how it is in other parts of the world, but in Colombia and in Ecuador, where you're from, I don't think you'll do anything as long as wealthy people are not interested in investing in education for everyone. So I think concrete policy issues that you could tackle would be that, like basically anything that allows you to get what resources families are spending in private education and pull that into the public sector. I think that would be tremendously helpful, not only because wealthier families and the very, very wealthy spend enormous amounts of their wealth on education, but more crucially, people in the middle of the spectrum tend to, for example, get indebted and really make huge sacrifices to access private education that isn't necessarily that good and that drains the public system from funds it desperately needs. So I think anything that incentivizes public education is a good idea. And then the other thing that I think is particular to the provision of education services compared to, for example, health services, is that it really does make a difference if everybody goes to school together. You can have hospitals that attend different sections of the population at different sites, and if they all do a good job, you have everyone covered, and that's okay. I think the education sector is more demanding. I think you really need, exactly as Nina is pointing out, as long as they're segregated, you really won't achieve the type of societal change that you strive for. And that is that is hard, because in cities like Bogota, for example, it would mean mixing people who physically inhabit different regions of the city. So you start to have to think about, I don't know, city planning and a bunch of really, really complicated things that I know nothing about. But I think the way forward is that just public schools and supporting public schools as much as you can, and making it as easy for individual families to support public schools as you can. That'd be my take. Carol, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing all of this. It's really lovely to see, always, for us, it's a pleasure. So, and I applaud the point you just made about investment in the public sector. This is so important, emphatically important. And we see it, we see the impact everywhere. Anybody, who's worked in and around the sector, you see the impact of this. And you're absolutely right, the draining. And the private sector, just by definition, cannot be the solution because of the way it diverts things. So I think everybody in this room is a believer in that, understanding where they're coming from. But on that note, I wanted to ask what you think about how, going towards a solution. Investment, you're right that investment in the public sector is super important. It's also true that when investors always tend to be obsessed with numbers and measurement. And when I was thinking about your results that you presented, the first thing that came to mind, I'm a bit of a numbers person, was, what you're going to find is that the impact. So, they're looking at number of beneficiaries reached when they're making an investment. And in your case, they're going to, what you see is a greater impact, a greater need, and a better impact on investment in the rural, which are going to probably have a lower student ratio. So they're going to reach less beneficiaries with the same investment in the schools that have the biggest need. So what I wanted to ask you was, what do you think about that? How can your research support the kind of investment that seems to be needed?
So you're in a way, you're asking me to solve the issue of rural education. Thank you. I won't solve it, but I'll give it a go. And I'm sure Diana might have interesting things to say. She was a teacher in the rural sections of Colombia for a bit. I think one thing I would say that research such as this can contribute is that I don't think it's always easy to see how small results that are apparently small have a large impact. And I think research such as this shows that even if your coefficients aren't super big, even if you're going to have to wait. I mean, I only saw results for 2 years, and everything in education, if you haven't done it for 10 years, you haven't done anything. Like, you haven't even graduated kids from school. But I think results such as this show that even if you don't think that you're making a difference, if you're focusing on the right populations, then you probably are. I don't know how many people that'll convince. I for sure don't know how many investors it'll convince. Yeah. The other side of it, which is really, really tricky with rural education, is that I think the temptation is always to just build schools because they're visible, because they win elections, because you can show that you built a school. They're like really, they're really good local policy tools, local politics tools. And I wouldn't want this research to end up meaning that we build more schools, more mega schools in rural areas where they're just not going to be used because the kids for them are not there. So there's a really, I think what we need there are school models that allow us to attend better regions that have very low population densities. And for that, I think the model, the type of school that I'm looking at is just not necessarily the most relevant. Yeah, that one's really hard. I'm not sure what else to say about that. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that, but
No, you're right. It's a bit of an unfair question. I'm sorry.
no, it's
No,
not
just
an
interesting.
unfair one. It's just a really, really hard one. Yeah, I'll
Isabel, I would like, Ruth had a question. Ruth, you wrote it, but maybe you can unmute and you explain you actually ask your question in the forum.
Oh, on the chat. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But maybe Ruth can unmute and yeah.
Oh, hello everyone. Isabel, it's been wonderful getting to know something about your work, and I got curious about relating the content of learning with the job market, the future of the student. Why are people learning? And as we are looking at the quality of learning all the time we are spending in school, how does it impact on the future of that student in relation to the job market and the business world later on? So, as in, that was my question.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, so the data of Prueba Saber doesn't have anything, doesn't allow me to see, for example, what lines of work the students then later go into, how many of them get into university. I have no data on that for that. And then the job market is even further away from that. However, I think you can say that if students are testing better in the 9th and the 11th grade, so the grades right before going to university, they are more likely, A, to stay in education systems. We know that students who perform better are more likely to continue studying. And B, because they test better, they are also more likely to access education opportunities. So hereby I mean not only like places in universities, but scholarships, financial aid, the type of thing that will get kids who can't afford it or whose families can't afford it better education, and therefore better chances at the labor market. And then the other thing that I think you could drive from the research is that in terms of school dropouts, I didn't include that in my data. You could, like, that data is available. I just didn't include it this time. But I think students who perform better are also less likely to drop out of school. And so therefore there might be incentives if they're doing better to stay in school. The issue there, as I mentioned briefly in the beginning, is that apparently there seems to be this effect of lowering the opportunity cost of staying in school if you only do it for half a day. I think that is a very, very problematic way of thinking about school children. If you're 14 and what policymakers are thinking about you is that you should be going to school and then working afterwards, you have a very different worldview than mine. But I think then you could think about, you could explore, I didn't, but you could explore how much that the lengthening of that school day relates to dropout rates. I don't think data is very strong on that. From what I know about dropouts investigations in Colombia, that is not supported. But yeah, you would have to do more research on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Isa, I have a data on that question from Ruth. So I work for this organization. It's called Alianza Educativa, and basically, it's this organization administrates 11 different public schools on this kind of charter schools model in Colombia. And this indicator on the webpage doesn't have the source data, but there we can see that it's like not a big percentage of people that goes into superior education. In Colombia, it's almost 38% of the people who come into this superior education. But I think that it's important to see also how many people actually do finish school completely, and also what percentage of these people do complete their superior education in the end. Just like another comment, I think that there are many other factors or things to look at, because time is for schools in Colombia something that it's very valuable, but it's also hard to see or to look at. For example, for me, even just to speak to the head teachers or to the teachers in other schools, it's very difficult because all the time they are running from one place to the other, and they're having many things on top of them. And time is actually something that we all lack of in schools. So yeah, I kind of got into a meditative question on that, about time and how to handle time in schools as well. And sorry, I don't have any other questions about or answers about rural education that you mentioned before. So yeah, I'll have to tell you that later.
Yeah, that's a very tough. Well, thank you, Yanis. Yeah, in schools, nobody has enough time in school. Any teacher will tell you that. This is probably just, I hadn't thought about this, but this is probably just me processing the years as a high school teacher and just being behind everything all the time. So yeah, maybe something about that as well. Okay, I'm not sure if there's somebody, oh, on the chat, Dianis wrote, okay, cool. Okay. Good. Okay, so if nobody else has anything else, right? Okay. So this was really, really lovely. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the questions, the really, really hard ones and the just hard ones included. Thank you. Yeah.
Isabel, thank you so much for sharing. As I said, ethical leadership is about sharing knowledge. Really appreciate it. I think that's just the perfect size, not too big, so everybody could come in. It's really amazing to see people really from very different countries, and we have some people who have more of a secondary education background, and then some who've got more a higher education background, and also others, and it's great because it all hangs together. So Isabel, thank you so much. It would be great. I suggest that we share the link to your thesis as well. Okay, so anybody's interested in your contact would be fantastic. So if anybody wants to follow up. And our goal is to really have a talk, a discussion, a dialogue every month. And if any of you would like to share, and I know we've got, I've already convinced Anne there to present her research in January, actually, about learning spaces. That's a really big theme as well, but I'm sure we've got others here as well, Lamia, in the theme of internationalization, or anybody, please knock on our door. This is what we feel very passionate about, and so please let us know. And if you agree, we keep you on a list, you know, and if you feel you want to drop in, do so. It's great, and thank you so much for contributing, for being here, and social justice is something, I think it's a really important theme, especially as sometimes at a policy level we are very caught up in a more neoliberal talk that has got its space as well, but I think social justice has an important place, and we need to balance these, you know, being in education.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. And now I'm really excited for the next versions of this.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Bye.
Wishing everybody a nice evening, and see you soon.